Part 1. The History of a Family. Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. The story of the Karamazov family begins with its patriarch, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, a man whose very existence seemed to mock all notions of decency and paternal responsibility. Living in a provincial Russian town during the turbulent 1860, Fyodor embodied the worst characteristics of the declining landowner class. He was simultaneously a buffoon and a shrewd businessman, a sensualist who pursued pleasure with shameless abandon while cunningly accumulating wealth through dubious means. Fyodor had been married twice, and both marriages ended in disaster, largely due to his own moral depravity. His first wife, Adelaida Ivanovna, came from a respectable noble family and brought with her a modest dowry of 25,000 rubles. She was a woman of passionate temperament, intelligent and impulsive, qualities that initially attracted the young Fyodor. However, she soon discovered that her husband was nothing more than a contemptible parasite who viewed their marriage as merely a financial transaction. The realization of what she had become, the wife of such a man, filled her with disgust and rage. After 3 years of increasingly bitter marriage, Adelaida made a scandalous decision that shocked provincial society. She abandoned her husband and, more shockingly still, her 3-year-old son Dmitri. She ran away with a destitute divinity student, a man who represented everything Fyodor was not: educated, idealistic, and poor. The lovers fled to Petersburg, where Adelaida died shortly after, apparently from typhus, though some whispered it was from the hardships of her new life. She died alone and forgotten, having exchanged one form of misery for another. Fyodor's response to his wife's abandonment was characteristically callous. Rather than grief or shame, he felt only relief and opportunity. He immediately began converting her dowry and property into cash, which he used to fund an increasingly dissolute lifestyle. As for his young son Dmitri, Fyodor seemed to forget the child's existence entirely. The boy was passed from one household to another, first to his mother's cousin, then to a distant relative of his father's, then to others, like an unwanted parcel that no one quite knew what to do with. Dmitri grew up essentially an orphan, despite having a living father who was prospering financially just a few towns away. The second marriage and second family. 8 years after Adelaida's departure, when Fyodor was well into his 40s and thoroughly debauched, he married again. His second wife was Sofia Ivanovna, a mere 16 years old, a girl, really not a woman. She was a pitiful creature, an orphan without family or fortune, remarkable only for her exceptional beauty and her meek, suffering disposition. There were those who said she possessed a kind of innocent spirituality, but this quality, if it existed, only made her more vulnerable to Fyodor's cruelty. The marriage was a grotesque mismatch from the beginning. Sofia had been raised in the household of a tyrannical benefactress who treated her as little more than a servant, and she entered marriage hoping for protection and kindness. Instead, she found herself trapped with a man who viewed her innocence as an invitation to torment. Fyodor filled their home with orgies and debauchery, regularly bringing in women of questionable character and subjecting his young wife to humiliation after humiliation. He seemed to take particular pleasure in mocking her religious faith and her moral sensibilities. Sofia bore this treatment for 8 years, during which time she gave birth to 2 sons, Ivan and Alexei. But the constant degradation took its toll on her fragile psyche. She developed what contemporary medicine called hysteria, violent fits of screaming and convulsions. Some in the town whispered that she was possessed by demons, while others, more charitably, recognized it as a breakdown brought on by unbearable suffering. She would lock herself in her room for hours, weeping and praying, while her 2 small boys cowered in fear, not understanding what was wrong with their mother. When Sofia finally died, still a young woman, worn out by suffering, Fyodor's reaction was identical to his response after his first wife's departure. He showed no grief, only a kind of gleeful relief at being free again. And just as he had done with Dmitri, he immediately abandoned his 2 younger sons. Ivan was 8 years old and Alexei only 4 when their mother died. They were taken in by Yefim Petrovich Polnov, the marshal of nobility in the district, and a man who had been a friend to their mother. Once again, Fyodor seemed to forget he even had children, returning to his life of dissolution as if they had never existed. The three sons, Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha. Dmitri Fyodorovich Karamazov, the eldest son, grew up wild and undisciplined, passed between various guardians who provided him with fragmented education and no real home. By the time he reached adolescence, he had developed into a passionate, headstrong youth with his father's capacity for excess, but combined with a certain romantic nobility that Fyodor entirely lacked. Dmitri entered military service as a young man and served with distinction, developing a reputation as a brave officer, but also as someone prone to wild behavior, drinking, gambling, and engaging in romantic entanglements with a fervor that bordered on recklessness. When Dmitri came of age and discovered he had an inheritance from his mother, he approached his father to claim it. This meeting marked the beginning of a bitter financial dispute that would poison their relationship for years. Fyodor claimed that the money had long ago been spent on Dmitri's upbringing and education, a transparent lie, since Fyodor had abandoned his son and contributed nothing to his care. But proving this was difficult, and the dispute dragged on, filled with acrimony and mutual accusations. Dmitri came to view his father not just with the normal resentment a neglected son might feel, but with active hatred and a conviction that Fyodor had stolen what was rightfully his. Ivan Fyodorovich, the middle son, took an entirely different path. Where Dmitri was passionate and impulsive, Ivan was intellectual and calculating. He excelled in his studies and eventually enrolled at the university in Moscow, where he distinguished himself as a brilliant student. Ivan supported himself through journalism, writing articles on philosophical and social topics that gained him some recognition in intellectual circles. He developed a reputation as a radical thinker, though his radicalism was of a peculiar kind, philosophical rather than political, more concerned with ultimate questions about God, morality, and human nature than with the social reforms that preoccupied other young intellectuals of the time. Despite his success, Ivan remained emotionally detached and cynical. He showed little interest in his family and seemed to regard his father with cold contempt rather than the hot anger that consumed Dmitri. There was something enigmatic about Ivan, a sense that behind his intellectual brilliance lay a deep inner conflict that he shared with no one. His ideas about morality and God were disturbing to those who heard them, and some suspected that his atheism was not the comfortable unbelief of a rationalist, but rather a tormented rebellion against a God he could neither accept nor entirely reject. Alexei Fyodorovich, universally known as Alyosha, was the youngest and in many ways the most remarkable of the three brothers. At 20 years old, he stood out not through any obvious talent or achievement, but through an indefinable quality of soul that drew people to him. Even those who barely knew him felt affection for him. There was something in his nature that inspired trust and confidence. He was incapable of judging others harshly, yet he was not naive about human nature. He listened without condemning, helped without expecting gratitude, and loved without demanding love in return. What made Alyosha's character even more remarkable was that he was, after all, a son of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. How could such purity have emerged from such corruption? How could such selfless goodness be the product of such a selfish and degraded father? It seemed like a biological impossibility, a joke of nature. Yet there he was, living proof that heredity and environment need not determine destiny, that grace can appear where it has no right to be. Alyosha had returned to his hometown with the startling announcement that he intended to enter the monastery. This decision puzzled everyone, including his father and brothers. He was young, handsome, and clearly capable of succeeding in the world. Why would he choose the monastic life? Some suspected it was a phase, a youthful religious enthusiasm that would pass. Others thought there must be some hidden sorrow or disappointment driving him to renounce the world. But the truth was simpler and more mysterious. Alyosha felt called to this life in a way he could not fully explain, even to himself. Elder Zosima and the monastery. Alyosha entered the monastery as a novice under the guidance of Elder Zosima, the most revered spiritual father in the entire region. The institution of elders in Russian monasteries was controversial and not universally accepted even within the Orthodox Church. An elder was not merely a spiritual advisor or confessor, but something much more demanding. A figure who required complete obedience from his disciples. To submit to an elder meant renouncing one's own will entirely, confessing every thought and action, and seeking the elder's guidance in every decision, no matter how small. Critics of this institution argued that it destroyed human freedom and created a kind of spiritual slavery. They said it was dangerous to give one man such absolute authority over others, that it encouraged fanaticism and superstition, and that it was fundamentally opposed to the modern spirit of individual liberty and rational thought. But believers in the tradition responded that this was precisely the point, that the surrender of individual will was not slavery but liberation from the tyranny of the ego, from the prison of self-centered existence. Through obedience to an elder, they claimed, one learned true freedom. Freedom from passion, from pride, from the endless calculations of self-interest. Elder Zosima himself was a figure who inspired devotion and controversy in equal measure. He was an old man, physically frail, but with eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. His past was unusual for a monk. He had been a military officer in his youth, had fought a duel, and had lived a worldly life before his conversion. This background gave him an understanding of human nature that purely cloistered monks sometimes lacked. He could speak to the passions and struggles of ordinary people because he had experienced them himself. Zosima's teaching emphasized active love, love expressed in concrete deeds rather than abstract sentiments. He was suspicious of those who loved humanity in general while remaining cold to individual human beings. He taught that salvation came not through ascetic withdrawal from the world, but through engagement with it, through patient service to others, through the acceptance of suffering as a means of participating in Christ's redemption of the world. This was a very different spirituality from the harsh, world-denying asceticism practiced by some other monks in the monastery, particularly Father Ferapont, who represented an older, more severe tradition. Part 2. An unfortunate gathering. The meeting at the monastery. A meeting was arranged at the monastery to resolve the bitter financial dispute between Fyodor and Dmitri. The idea came from Alyosha, who hoped that Elder Zosima's moral authority might prevent the conflict from escalating into violence. But from the moment the participants began arriving, it was clear that this hope was naive. Fyodor arrived dressed inappropriately, making jokes, and generally behaving as if he were attending a social entertainment rather than a serious mediation. Ivan came reluctantly, clearly embarrassed by his father, but unwilling to openly oppose him. Also present was Fyodor Alexandrovich Miusov, a liberal landowner and distant relative of the family who had been one of young Ivan's guardians. Miusov represented the educated, progressive nobility. He had traveled in Europe, spoke French fluently, and prided himself on his enlightened views. But he was also vain and touchy about his dignity, which made him particularly vulnerable to Fyodor's mockery. The presence of such a man seemed to bring out the worst in Fyodor, who could not resist the opportunity to shock and offend someone who took himself so seriously. As they waited for Dmitri, who was characteristically late, Fyodor began performing. There is no other word for it. He put on a show, playing the buffoon with such commitment that it was unclear whether he was mocking himself, his companions, or the sacred setting of the monastery. He made inappropriate jokes, told ridiculous lies, and generally behaved in a way calculated to offend everyone present. Yet underneath the buffoonery, one could sense something darker, a kind of self-hatred, a compulsive need to degrade himself and destroy any possibility of genuine human connection. Elder Zosima watched all this with compassion rather than judgment. When Fyodor claimed to be a shameless liar who sometimes lied for no reason at all, the elder gently asked why he hated himself so much. This simple question cut through all of Fyodor's defenses. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and something genuinely vulnerable showed in his face. But he quickly covered it with another joke, unable to bear the exposure of his true self even for an instant. Peasant women and questions of faith. While the Karamazovs and Miusov waited in the elder's reception room, the narrative takes a detour to observe Zosima's regular practice of receiving pilgrims, mostly peasant women from the surrounding countryside who came seeking his blessing, his prayers, or his counsel in their sufferings. This interlude serves to show a different aspect of religious faith from the intellectual debates that dominate much of the novel. Here we see simple, unquestioning belief, the faith of ordinary people who accept the Church's teachings without philosophical complexity. Among these women was a mother who had lost her 3-year-old son and could not stop grieving. She asked the elder if she would see her child again in heaven, if he would know her there. Zosima assured her that she would indeed be reunited with her son, that in the kingdom of heaven there is special joy when parents are reunited with their children. He told her that her little one was with the angels now and was praying for her. He advised her not to weep endlessly in despair, but to transform her sorrow into quiet joy, knowing that her child lived, though invisible to her. The woman left comforted, her tears changing from tears of grief to tears of consolation. Then came Madame Holikov, an elegant widow of 30 with her 14-year-old daughter Liz, who was confined to a wheelchair. Madame Holikov represented a very different type from the peasant women. She was educated, sophisticated, and tormented by intellectual doubts rather than simple grief. She confessed to Zosima that she was plagued by questions about faith, that she wanted to believe in God and immortality, but could not quite convince herself. She asked how she could overcome this lack of faith. Zosima's answer was profound in its simplicity: by active love. He told her to strive to love her neighbor actively and constantly, and that as she advanced in love, she would grow more convinced of the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. He said this had been tested and was certain. But Madame Holikov expressed a fear that resonated with many intellectuals who dreamed of serving humanity. She said she was terrified that if she actually had to live with those she wished to serve, to endure their ingratitude and imperfections, she would end up despising them rather than loving them. To this honest confession, Zosima responded that her self-knowledge was already the beginning of wisdom. He acknowledged that the love of humanity in general is almost always a form of self-love, while active love is labor and persistence, often unrewarded and unappreciated. But he promised her that at the very moment when she sees with horror that despite all her efforts, she has not only failed to come closer to her goal, but seems to have gotten further away from it. At that very moment, she will have reached her goal and will recognize the miraculous power of God who has always loved her. This teaching about the difficulty of active love versus the ease of loving humanity in the abstract would become one of the novel's central themes. Dmitri arrives and the elders bow. Finally, Dmitri burst into the room, late and agitated. He was tall and muscular, with wild eyes and disheveled hair, looking as if he had not slept for days. His entrance immediately filled the room with tension. Here was violence barely contained, passion on the edge of explosion. He began speaking rapidly, incoherently, accusing his father of theft and humiliation, claiming that Fyodor stood between him and his happiness. This last accusation revealed the heart of the matter. Both father and son had become infatuated with the same woman. Her name was Agrafena Alexandrovna, called Grushenka, a beautiful woman of about 22 with a complicated and somewhat scandalous past. Dmitri was officially engaged to another woman, Katerina Ivanovna, a proud beauty from a noble family. But he had become obsessed with Grushenka, visiting her constantly, spending money recklessly in his pursuit of her affections. And Fyodor, despite his age and the fact that Dmitri was his son, had developed an equally obsessive passion for the same woman. The situation was grotesque in its perversity, father and son competing for the same woman's attention, each accusing the other of standing in his way. Fyodor mocked Dmitri's poverty, saying that Grushenka would never choose a penniless soldier over a wealthy man. Dmitri lunged at his father in rage, and it took both Alyosha and Ivan to restrain him. The room erupted in chaos, with accusations and counter-accusations flying, the atmosphere thick with the possibility of violence. Then something unexpected happened. Elder Zosima slowly rose from his chair and, to everyone's astonishment, walked over to Dmitri and fell to his knees before him. He bowed until his forehead touched the ground, a gesture of the deepest reverence and humility in Russian Orthodox tradition. Then he rose without a word and returned to his chair, leaving everyone stunned and confused. No one understood the meaning of this gesture at the time. Why would a holy elder bow down before a dissolute, violent soldier? What could it possibly mean? Only later, after everything that followed, would Alyosha come to understand. It was a bow to the great suffering that awaited Dmitri, a gesture of compassion for a soul about to enter its darkest trial. Zosima, with his spiritual insight, had foreseen something of what was coming, and his bow was both a blessing and a recognition of the terrible burden Dmitri would soon bear. Part 3. The Sensualists. The fourth brother, Smerdyakov. In Fyodor's household lived another son, though never acknowledged as such, Pavel Fyodorovich Smerdyakov. His mother had been a woman known throughout the town as Stinking Lizaveta, a homeless, mentally disabled woman who could barely speak and was pitied by some, mocked by others. One night, she was found in Fyodor's garden, apparently having been raped by someone, and many suspected it was Fyodor himself. She died giving birth to a son, and Fyodor took the infant into his household not as a son but as a servant, giving him to his cook, Grigory, and his wife to raise. Smerdyakov grew up to be a strange, unsettling young man. He had a pale face with thin lips, cold eyes, and a manner that combined servility with contempt. He was intelligent, but used his intelligence in peculiar ways. He loved to argue about philosophical questions, particularly religious ones, taking positions that seemed designed to disturb and provoke. He suffered from epileptic fits, though some suspected he might be exaggerating their frequency and severity for his own purposes. What made Smerdyakov particularly dangerous was his relationship with Ivan. The intellectual brother had taught his servant half-brother various ideas about morality and religion, probably not intending them as practical guides to life, but rather as intellectual exercises. Smerdyakov, however, took these ideas with deadly seriousness. When Ivan argued that if there is no God and no immortality, then everything is permitted, including murder, Smerdyakov listened and absorbed this principle as a literal truth. He became Ivan's dark mirror, the embodiment of what happens when nihilistic philosophy is actually put into practice rather than remaining safely in the realm of abstract speculation. Dmitri's confession over brandy. One evening, Dmitri took Alyosha to a tavern and, fortified by alcohol, made a long, rambling confession about his life and current predicament. He spoke about what he called the Karamazov baseness, the family's capacity for both the highest nobility and the lowest degradation, often simultaneously. He talked about beauty, claiming it was a terrible and awful thing because it contained contradictions. The same person could be moved to tears by a beautiful sight and the next moment commit an act of cruelty. The ideal of Sodom and the ideal of the Madonna could coexist in the same heart, and sometimes Sodom was even more attractive. Dmitri then told the story of how he became engaged to Katerina Ivanovna. Her father, his commanding officer, had embezzled government funds and faced ruin and disgrace when the theft was discovered. Dmitri had enough money to save him, 4,000 rubles, but he told Katerina that she must come to him alone, to his lodgings, to ask for it personally. He admitted that his intention was to humiliate her, this proud beauty, to make her bow before him and beg. But when she actually came, when she prostrated herself before him with such desperate courage to save her father's honor, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling triumphant, Dmitri was overwhelmed by her nobility and sacrifice. He gave her the money and asked nothing in return, kissed her hand reverently, and swore she would be his goddess forever. So began their engagement, founded not on love, but on his one moment of unexpected nobility and her gratitude mixed with shame. However, this relationship of mutual debt rather than affection was doomed from the start. After the engagement, Katerina gave Dmitri 3,000 rubles to send to her sister and relatives in Moscow, but Dmitri did not send it. He spent half on a wild spree with Grushenka, and he kept the rest sewn in a bag around his neck, supposedly to return it later, but really keeping it for another spree with Grushenka when the moment came. He confessed to Alyosha that he was a thief, a scoundrel, a man without honor, but insisted he was not a murderer, that there was a line he could not cross. The two women meet. Alyosha visited Katerina Ivanovna at her house, where she spoke passionately about her determination to save Dmitri from himself and from his father's corrupting influence. She insisted that her love would redeem him, that she would never abandon him no matter how he behaved. There was something excessive in this devotion, something that seemed to have more to do with her pride in her own capacity for sacrifice than with genuine love for Dmitri as a person. Then, unexpectedly, Grushenka arrived. The two women faced each other like queens from opposing kingdoms, Katerina representing noble pride and moral superiority, Grushenka embodying earthly sensuality and freedom from social pretensions. Each saw in the other everything she herself lacked and perhaps secretly envied. Katerina extended her hand graciously, as if conferring a favor on a social inferior. Grushenka suddenly fell to her knees and kissed Katerina's hand with exaggerated humility. But then Grushenka jumped up, laughing, revealing that the gesture had been mockery rather than respect. She had kissed Katerina's hand as she had promised Dmitri she would, but her real intention was to humiliate the proud woman, to show that all her nobility meant nothing in the contest for Dmitri's heart. She left with a parting shot about how Katerina would eventually kiss her hand next, in the dust. Katerina stood trembling with rage and humiliation, her carefully maintained dignity shattered by this encounter with a woman who refused to acknowledge her social and moral superiority. Part 4. Lacerations. Alyosha in the world. This section of the novel follows Alyosha as he moves through various households and encounters, carrying out his elder's instruction to go into the world rather than remaining cloistered in the monastery. These encounters reveal different forms of suffering and different human responses to that suffering. What Dostoevsky called lacerations, wounds that people inflict on themselves and others, often in the very act of trying to assert their dignity or worth. Alyosha encountered a group of schoolboys who were throwing stones at another boy, Alyosha Sneguryov. When Alyosha saw Alyosha, he suddenly threw a stone that hit him in the shoulder, then ran away crying. Following the boy led Alyosha to discover a family living in terrible poverty. The father, Captain Sneguryov, had been a military officer but now existed on the edge of destitution, his pride wounded, his family barely surviving. The reason for Alyosha's hostility emerged. Dmitri had publicly humiliated Captain Sneguryov in a tavern, dragging him out by his beard in front of the whole town, including his young son. The boy's stone-throwing was his attempt to defend his father's honor, to strike back at the Karamazov family in the only way available to him. When Alyosha offered money as compensation, 200 rubles sent by Dmitri in remorse, the captain's response revealed the complexity of poverty and pride. Sneguryov reached for the money with trembling hands, counting it, imagining all the things he could do with it: medicine for his sick wife, food for his children, perhaps even a chance to move to a different town where the humiliation would not follow them. For several minutes, he allowed himself to hope, to dream of a better future. But then, abruptly, he crumpled the bills and threw them back at Alyosha's feet, shouting that he would not sell his honor, that his son had seen him humiliated, and he could not teach the boy that degradation could be compensated with money. The engagement of Alyosha and Lies. Another laceration appeared in the relationship between Alyosha and Lies Holikov, Madame Holikov's 14-year-old daughter. Lies was confined to a wheelchair, her body crippled but her spirit fierce and intelligent. She had developed a passionate attachment to Alyosha, expressing it with the directness and intensity that only adolescent first love can achieve. She wrote him letters confessing her feelings and eventually proposed that he leave the monastery and marry her. Alyosha, with characteristic honesty and gentleness, admitted that he loved her too. But he explained that he felt called to monastic life, that he had made a promise to God that he could not easily break. This created a strange, unconsummated engagement between them. They loved each other and even considered themselves engaged, but with the understanding that the engagement might never lead to marriage. It was a relationship of pure feeling without the usual trajectory toward physical fulfillment, another form of laceration in which genuine emotion produced suffering rather than happiness. Katerina and Ivan. Meanwhile, Katerina Ivanovna and Ivan had developed a complex relationship of their own. Ostensibly, Ivan was helping Katerina in her determination to save Dmitri, providing advice, moral support, and practical assistance. But underneath, this noble purpose lay something else: a growing intimacy and emotional dependence that neither quite acknowledged. They spent long hours together discussing Dmitri's character, debating what could be done to save him from himself, analyzing his every action and motive. Ivan began to suggest, gently at first and then more insistently, that Katerina's devotion to Dmitri was a form of self-torture, that she did not really love Dmitri but rather loved her own suffering, her own pride in sacrificing herself for someone unworthy. He argued that she should let Dmitri go, that she was destroying herself for nothing. These arguments contained truth, but they also served Ivan's own interests, for he was falling in love with Katerina himself, or something that resembled love in his emotionally constrained world. Katerina resisted these arguments, insisting that she would never abandon Dmitri, that she would follow him even to Siberia if necessary, that her love would redeem him despite everything. But her protests had a forced quality, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as Ivan. The truth was that her feelings for the two brothers had become hopelessly tangled. She was bound to Dmitri by honor and pride, but drawn to Ivan by genuine intellectual and emotional affinity. This confusion would later have tragic consequences. Part 5. Pro and Contra. The brothers' talk. Rebellion. Ivan and Alyosha met for a conversation that would become one of the most famous philosophical exchanges in world literature. They met at a tavern, an unlikely setting for a discussion of ultimate questions about God and human suffering, but perhaps appropriate for the kind of honest, unguarded conversation they were about to have. Ivan smoked and drank wine, while Alyosha sipped tea, and they talked as they had never talked before. Ivan began by saying that he accepted God. This surprised Alyosha, who had thought his brother was an atheist, but Ivan clarified. He accepted God, accepted divine wisdom and divine purpose, but he did not accept God's world. He could not accept a world containing so much suffering, particularly the suffering of innocent children. This was not a rational argument but a moral rebellion, a refusal to participate in a cosmic system that required such sacrifices. To illustrate his point, Ivan recounted several true stories he had collected from newspapers and other sources, stories of children suffering in ways almost too horrible to imagine. A 5-year-old girl beaten by her parents and locked in an outhouse in the freezing cold, crying to God to save her, but receiving no answer. An 8-year-old serf boy torn to pieces by hunting dogs as punishment for accidentally injuring his master's favorite hound, while his mother was forced to watch. A baby smiling up at its mother, while the mother smiled back, and then the mother hearing soldiers outside and smothering her child to prevent its cries from revealing their hiding place. Why did Ivan tell these terrible stories? Because he wanted Alyosha to understand his rebellion, to feel its full force. Religious people and philosophers said that all this suffering was necessary for some higher harmony, some ultimate justice that would make everything clear and right. They said that in the final accounting, when God's plan was fully revealed, we would see that every tear was necessary, that even the torture of children served a purpose in the grand scheme. But Ivan rejected this utterly. Even if there would be a final harmony, even if everything would be explained and justified, even if victims would forgive their torturers and all would embrace in universal reconciliation, he still returned his ticket to this show. He did not want harmony at such a price. He did not want a universe where a mother's eternal blessedness was somehow built on the torture of even one child. The price of admission was too high, and he respectfully returned his ticket. The Grand Inquisitor. After this declaration of rebellion, Ivan told Alyosha that he had written a kind of prose poem called The Grand Inquisitor. It was set in Seville, Spain, during the 16th century, at the height of the Inquisition. The day before, nearly 100 heretics had been burned at the stake for the greater glory of God in the presence of the king, the court, and the people. But the next day, Christ himself appears quietly in the city. He performs no miracles at first, but people recognize him immediately. There is something in his eyes, in his gentle presence, that is unmistakable. He touches a blind man who immediately regains his sight. When a funeral procession passes carrying a 7-year-old girl who has died, he stops it and says simply, "Maiden, arise," and she sits up in the coffin, opening her eyes and smiling. The people begin to gather around him with growing excitement and love. But at this moment, the Grand Inquisitor appears. A cardinal of the church, 90 years old, tall and erect despite his age, with a withered face and sunken eyes that still gleam with sinister fire. He has been watching from the cathedral steps. He points at Christ, and the guards immediately seize him and drag him to prison. The crowd parts in fear of the inquisitor, and no one dares to protest. That night, the inquisitor visits Christ in his prison cell. He locks the door behind him and stands before the prisoner, who sits calmly in silence. The inquisitor begins to speak, and what follows is an extraordinary monologue in which he explains why the Church, or at least his version of the Church, must reject Christ and his teaching of freedom. The inquisitor asks Christ why he has returned to interfere with the Church's work. He reminds Christ of the 3 temptations in the desert, when the devil offered to turn stones to bread, to perform a miracle by jumping from the temple, and to rule all the kingdoms of the world. Christ rejected all 3 temptations, choosing freedom over security, faith over certainty, spiritual truth over earthly power. But the inquisitor says these were terrible mistakes, and the Church has spent 15 centuries correcting them. The inquisitor explains his philosophy: mankind cannot bear the burden of freedom. People are weak, vicious, worthless, and rebellious. They need bread, miracles, and authority, not the freedom to choose between good and evil. So the Church has given them what they need: material security through economic power, miracles and mystery through religious ritual, and absolute authority through hierarchical structure. The Church has essentially accepted the 3 temptations that Christ rejected, and by doing so, it has made people happy. Of course, this happiness is the happiness of slaves, the contentment of those who have been relieved of the terrible responsibility of freedom. But the inquisitor argues that this is what people truly want. They cannot handle freedom. It frightens and overwhelms them. They would rather have bread and circuses, certainty and submission, than the agonizing burden of making their own choices and living with the consequences. The inquisitor reveals that he and the other leaders of the Church do not really believe in God. They are atheists who have taken on the burden of leadership, accepting damnation for themselves in order to provide happiness for the masses. They have allied themselves with the devil, the wise and dread spirit, accepting his offer of earthly power in exchange for their souls. Tomorrow, the inquisitor says, he will burn Christ at the stake as the worst of heretics, and the people will help heap the coals around the fire because the inquisitor commands it. Throughout this entire monologue, Christ says nothing. He simply listens with infinite compassion, his eyes never leaving the old man's face. Then, when the inquisitor finally finishes speaking, Christ rises, approaches him, and gently kisses him on his bloodless, aged lips. The inquisitor shudders, clearly moved despite himself. He goes to the door, opens it, and says, "Go and come no more. Never, never again." Christ walks out into the dark streets, free, while the kiss glows on the old man's lips. Alyosha's response. When Ivan finished his story, Alyosha was silent for a long moment, tears streaming down his face. Then, without a word, he leaned over and kissed Ivan on the lips, exactly as Christ had kissed the inquisitor. Ivan laughed through his own tears, accusing Alyosha of literary theft. But the kiss was Alyosha's answer to Ivan's rebellion, not an intellectual argument but an expression of love, an affirmation that despite all the suffering, despite all the unanswerable questions, love remains possible and necessary. This was the essential difference between the brothers. Ivan's love for humanity was abstract and theoretical. He loved the idea of humanity, but could not quite love actual people with all their imperfections. Alyosha's love was concrete and active. He loved specific individuals, even when they disappointed or hurt him. Ivan demanded that the universe make sense before he would accept it. Alyosha accepted the universe despite its senselessness, choosing to love anyway, to act with compassion even when compassion seemed futile. Part 6. The Russian Monk. Elder Zosima's Life and Teaching. This section stands as Dostoevsky's answer to Ivan's rebellion, presenting Elder Zosima's vision of Christian faith as an alternative to both the inquisitor's authoritarian certainty and Ivan's intellectual rejection. Zosima lay dying, and Alyosha recorded his reminiscences and teachings during his final hours. The elder spoke of his own journey to faith, which had not been simple or automatic, but had involved a dramatic conversion experience. Zosima had been a military officer in his youth, proud, passionate, and concerned primarily with honor and reputation. He fought a duel over a woman he thought he loved, though it was really his wounded pride rather than love that motivated him. The night before the duel, he beat his servant brutally for some minor offense, and the man bore it in silence, as servants were expected to do. But the next morning, as Zosima prepared for the duel, he looked out his window and saw the sunrise. Something about that sight, the beauty of the world, the ordinary miracle of morning, suddenly made him understand the full horror of what he was about to do. He realized he had no right to kill another human being, just as he had no right to strike his servant. Every person, no matter how lowly in social station, carries within them the image of God. To harm anyone is to harm God himself, to diminish the divine presence in the world. This realization came to him not as an intellectual conclusion, but as an immediate, overwhelming certainty that changed everything. At the dueling ground, his opponent fired first and wounded him in the shoulder. But instead of firing back, Zosima threw his pistol away and asked for forgiveness. Everyone present thought he had gone mad. His opponent was insulted, feeling that Zosima was making a mockery of the duel. His friends were horrified, convinced he had disgraced himself beyond redemption. But Zosima had discovered the great secret that would become the foundation of his spiritual teaching: we are all responsible for all. This phrase, "we are all responsible for all," was central to Zosima's theology. It meant that no one could claim innocence, that everyone participated in the web of suffering and evil that characterized human existence. But it also meant that everyone had the power to reduce that suffering through concrete acts of love and self-sacrifice. If each person took responsibility, not just for their own sins, but for the sins of all, if each person actively loved their neighbors, then the world could be transformed. The teaching of active love. Zosima taught that faith was not primarily a matter of intellectual belief, but of active love. Love expressed in concrete deeds, in patient service to others, in the acceptance of suffering as a means of participating in Christ's redemption of the world. He was deeply suspicious of those who claimed to love humanity in general while remaining indifferent or even cruel to specific individuals. He had encountered many such people, philanthropists who dreamed of great reforms but could not treat their own servants with kindness, revolutionaries who loved the people as an abstraction but despised actual peasants. The elder insisted that active love was labor and persistence. It was not a warm feeling or a beautiful sentiment, but actual work, difficult, often unrewarding, requiring patience and humility. He promised that if someone persisted in loving others even when their ugliness and ingratitude revolted them, eventually that love would transform both the lover and the beloved. But he was honest about how difficult this was, how at times it would seem impossible, how one would despair of ever achieving it. Zosima also taught a profound reverence for all of creation. He said to love every leaf, every ray of light, every animal, every grain of sand. If you love each thing, you will perceive the mystery of God in all things. This was very different from the world-denying asceticism practiced by some monks, who viewed the material world as a temptation and a snare. For Zosima, the world was beautiful because God made it and declared it good. To reject the world was to reject God's gift. He spoke about the importance of memory, particularly memories from childhood. He said that if a person carried even one good memory from childhood, they could be saved by it. This teaching was remarkably hopeful. It suggested that goodness had a kind of permanence, that even brief experiences of love and beauty could sustain a person through years of darkness. It was this teaching that Alyosha would later invoke at Alyosha's funeral, urging the boys to preserve their memory of their friend as a sacred treasure. The elder's death. That night, surrounded by his disciples and speaking his final words of wisdom and encouragement, Elder Zosima died peacefully. His death marked a crucial turning point in the novel, particularly for Alyosha, whose faith would soon be tested in ways he could not have anticipated. The elder had been Alyosha's anchor, the embodiment of everything good and true about Christianity. With his death, Alyosha would have to discover whether his faith could survive without the constant presence of this holy man who had guided and protected him. Part 7. Alyosha. The odor of corruption. According to popular belief deeply rooted in Russian Orthodox tradition, the bodies of true saints did not decay after death but remained incorrupt, giving off a sweet fragrance like flowers or incense. The monks and townspeople who revered Elder Zosima expected this miracle from him. They believed his holiness would be confirmed by this sign, that his body would become a sacred relic, proof of God's special favor and the validity of his teachings. But nature, or perhaps God, had different plans. Far from remaining incorrupt, Zosima's body began to decompose rapidly, giving off a terrible stench that filled the cell where he lay and spread throughout the monastery. The smell was unmistakable and undeniable, the smell of organic decay, of mortality, of the inevitable return of flesh to dust. Within hours, everyone knew, and the news spread quickly through the town, the elder's body was corrupting. The reaction was swift and brutal. Those who had envied Zosima's popularity during his life now felt vindicated. Father Ferapont, the extreme ascetic who represented an older, harsher form of monasticism, rushed to the cell and began performing a kind of exorcism, shouting that the smell proved Zosima had been teaching heresy, that devils surrounded his coffin, that God had revealed the truth about this false elder. Many of the monks and laypeople who had revered Zosima now turned against his memory, taking the rapid decomposition as a sign of divine judgment. For Alyosha, this was a profound shock that struck at the very foundation of his faith. He had believed absolutely in his elder's holiness. He had witnessed Zosima's wisdom, his compassion, his deep spiritual insight. How could God allow such a man's body to decompose in this shameful way? How could God permit this humiliation of someone who had devoted his entire life to divine service? The questions tormented Alyosha, shaking his simple, childlike faith to its core. Alyosha's crisis and temptation. In his crisis of faith, Alyosha did something completely out of character. He fled the monastery and wandered aimlessly through the town, his mind in turmoil. He ended up at the house of Grushenka, the very woman who had caused such chaos in his family, the object of obsession for both his father and his brother Dmitri. Going to her house seemed almost like a deliberate act of self-destruction, a testing of whether everything really was permitted if God would allow such injustice as the humiliation of elder Zosima. Grushenka received him with initial amusement and a kind of predatory interest. Here was the pure young monk, the one everyone said was different from other Karamazovs, coming to her in his moment of crisis. She had planned to seduce him, to corrupt his innocence partly for fun and partly to prove that his vaunted purity was no different from anyone else's pretensions. But when she actually looked into his eyes and saw the genuine pain there, something in her changed. Instead of seducing him, she comforted him. She sat beside him, took his hand gently, and listened as he poured out his anguish about his elder's disgrace. In that moment, Grushenka revealed a capacity for compassion and self-restraint that surprised even herself. She told Alyosha that he had saved her soul. She had been planning to corrupt him, but his genuine goodness and real suffering had prevented her. In trying to help Alyosha, she helped herself, discovering that she too could choose good over evil, that she was capable of kindness and restraint. The vision of Kana. Alyosha returned to the monastery late that night and fell asleep beside his elder's coffin, exhausted by emotional turmoil. In his sleep, he had a vision that would restore his shaken faith and transform it into something stronger and more personal than it had been before. He dreamed that he was present at the wedding at Cana of Galilee, the occasion of Christ's first miracle when he turned water into wine. In the dream, Elder Zosima was there too, not as the frail old man Alyosha had known but young and joyful, participating in the celebration. The elder explained that he was there because he had given away an onion, referring to an old Russian fairy tale about a woman in hell who was offered salvation when an angel lowered an onion on a string, representing even the smallest act of kindness. Zosima told Alyosha that many people at the feast had given only one onion each, one small act of love or sacrifice, but it was enough. He urged Alyosha to join the feast, to see how Christ blessed the celebration and turned water to wine so that joy could continue. The vision communicated several profound truths to Alyosha. First, that his elder was indeed holy, regardless of what happened to his physical body after death. Second, that God's kingdom was characterized by joy and celebration rather than grim asceticism. Third, that even small acts of love and kindness have infinite value in God's eyes. Fourth, that the world is beautiful and worth loving because God is present in it. When Alyosha woke, he was transformed. He rushed outside into the monastery courtyard and fell to his knees, kissing the earth and weeping tears of joy rather than sorrow. He had understood that the world is beautiful because God created it and declared it good. Every star in the sky, every blade of grass, every suffering person, all are part of God's creation and worthy of love. His faith had been tested and had emerged stronger, no longer dependent on miracles or external signs, but rooted in a direct, personal experience of God's presence in the world. Part 8. Dmitri, the Night of Catastrophe. On the same night that Alyosha experienced his spiritual crisis and transformation, Dmitri was racing through town in a state of desperate frenzy. He needed money, 3,000 rubles, to repay what he had stolen from Katerina and to secure Grushenka's affections against his father's competing claims. He tried everyone he could think of: Madame Holikov, who refused him, a local merchant named Samsonov, who sent him on a wild goose chase, another merchant who was drunk and useless. Everywhere he went, doors closed in his face. Dmitri's desperation grew with each refusal. He had reached a point where his entire future seemed to depend on acquiring this sum of money. Without it, he would be exposed as a thief in Katerina's eyes, and he would lose any chance of winning Grushenka, who was being courted by both his father and a former lover who had recently returned to the area. The night took on a nightmarish quality as he rushed from place to place, his hopes rising and falling, his mental state becoming increasingly unstable. At his father's house. Finally, driven by desperation and rage, Dmitri made his way to his father's house. He knew that Fyodor kept 3,000 rubles in an envelope, marked as a gift for Grushenka if she would come to him. This knowledge had been tormenting Dmitri for weeks. The same amount he needed was sitting in his father's house, supposedly intended for the woman they both desired. The injustice of it, the grotesque appropriateness of it, drove him to the edge of murder. Dmitri climbed over the fence into his father's garden and approached the window. Through it, he could see Fyodor pacing anxiously, clearly waiting for someone, waiting for Grushenka, whom he expected to arrive at any moment. Dmitri had a brass pestle in his hand, taken from the house of one of the merchants he had visited. The temptation was overwhelming. Kill the old man, take the 3,000 rubles, solve all his problems in one violent act. He even had a kind of moral justification. Wasn't his father a monster who deserved to die? Wasn't he stealing from Dmitri's own inheritance? Wouldn't the world be better off without such a creature? Dmitri raised the pestle, his whole body trembling with rage and the terrible nearness of murder. But at the last moment, something stopped him. He could not do it. Despite everything, despite his father's cruelty, despite the desperate need, despite the overwhelming temptation, there was a line he could not cross. He lowered the pestle and began to back away from the window. But as he fled through the garden, he encountered Grigory, his father's elderly servant, who tried to stop him. In his agitated state, Dmitri struck the old man with the pestle, knocking him down. In the darkness, seeing blood on Grigory's head, Dmitri was convinced he had killed him. He ran from the house in horror, believing himself a murderer, though not of the person he had come there to kill. The night of revelry. Dmitri learned that Grushenka had gone to a village inn to meet Pani, Polish noble Masyalovich, her former lover who had returned after 5 years. The news was devastating. It seemed that Grushenka had chosen another man over both Dmitri and his father. But Dmitri, in his wild emotional state, decided on one final, desperate gesture. He still had the 1,500 rubles that he had kept sewn in a bag around his neck, stolen from Katerina. He would spend it all in one magnificent spree, winning Grushenka or dying in the attempt. Dmitri descended on the village inn like a force of nature, bringing champagne, food, musicians, and gifts. He spent money with reckless abandon, determined to create a celebration so extravagant that it would sweep Grushenka off her feet. The scene that followed was both tragic and farcical, a kind of fever dream of excess and desperation set against a shabby rural tavern. But as the night progressed, unexpected developments occurred. Grushenka's former lover, the Polish officer, turned out to be not the romantic figure she remembered, but a worn-out card-sharp and scoundrel who was only interested in her money. She saw through him quickly, her romantic illusions shattered. In her disillusionment, she turned to Dmitri, seeing in his passionate, reckless devotion something genuine that the calculating Pole could never offer. She declared that she chose Dmitri, and for a few hours they were ecstatically happy, believing they had finally found each other. But as dawn approached, Dmitri's euphoria gave way to despair. The reality of what he had done crashed down on him. He had struck Grigory, possibly killed him. He had spent the last of Katerina's money. He had no future except disgrace and ruin. He decided he must kill himself. It was the only honorable course remaining. He went outside to shoot himself with a pistol he had obtained, but before he could act, the police arrived to arrest him. Unknown to Dmitri, someone else had been murdered that night. His father, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. Part 9. The Preliminary Investigation. Dmitri's interrogation. Dmitri was taken to the police station and subjected to a lengthy interrogation. The evidence against him was overwhelming, almost mathematically perfect in its comprehensiveness. He had publicly threatened his father on multiple occasions. He had a clear motive, the dispute over money and the competition for Grushenka's affections. He had been seen in his father's garden that night. He was covered in blood. He had suddenly acquired several thousand rubles, which he spent lavishly at the inn. And the servant Grigory, who survived the blow from the pestle, testified that he had seen Dmitri in the garden and believed he had entered the house. The prosecutor and investigating magistrate built their case with confident efficiency, interpreting every fact in the most damning light. They were educated, well-meaning men who believed sincerely that they were serving justice, but their certainty about Dmitri's guilt made them deaf to anything that did not fit their theory. When Dmitri insisted he was innocent of patricide, they heard only the expected denials of a guilty man. When he tried to explain his complicated financial situation, they heard only evasions and lies. Dmitri's position was impossible. He could not explain where the money came from without admitting that he had stolen 1,500 rubles from Katerina months ago. To prove he did not steal 3,000 from his father, he would have to confess to stealing 1,500 from his fiancée, proving himself a thief either way. He tried initially to maintain his silence about the money's source, but this only made him appear more guilty. Finally, desperate to prove his innocence of murder, even at the cost of proving his guilt of theft, Dmitri revealed the shameful truth. The money he spent at the inn came from Katerina. She had given him 3,000 rubles months ago to send to her relatives in Moscow, but he had spent half immediately on a wild spree with Grushenka. He had kept the remaining 1,500 rubles sewn in a bag around his neck, supposedly intending to return it but really keeping it for another spree when the moment came. This was the money he had finally spent at the inn. This confession, which Dmitri believed would prove his innocence, actually made him look worse in the eyes of his interrogators. If he would steal from his own fiancée, a woman who had sacrificed her pride to help him, why would he hesitate to rob and murder his father? The logic seemed inexorable. Dmitri was formally charged with patricide and imprisoned to await trial, his protestations of innocence dismissed as the expected lies of a guilty man. Part 10. The Boys, Alyosha's illness and death. While these dramatic events were unfolding, another story was developing quietly in the background, the story of Alyosha Snegoryov and the schoolboys. Alyosha had not forgotten the boy who threw a stone at him or the impoverished family he discovered. He visited them regularly, and through his gentle persistence, he gradually won the trust of both Alyosha and his father, Captain Snegoryov. Alyosha also brought with him the group of schoolboys who had been Alyosha's tormentors, engineering a reconciliation between them. But Alyosha was seriously ill, consumption, the doctors said, though they could do little to treat it. The boy grew weaker week by week, and it became clear that he would not recover. The schoolboys, transformed by Alyosha's influence and by their own growing affection for Alyosha, visited him constantly. A community of love formed around this dying child, something beautiful emerging from what had begun with cruelty and stone-throwing. Alyosha's illness and approaching death affected his father terribly. Captain Snegoryov, who had already endured public humiliation and grinding poverty, now faced the loss of his beloved son. He oscillated between frantic hopes for a miracle cure and resignation to the inevitable. His love for the boy was painful to witness, so fierce and helpless, so completely unable to prevent the slow approach of death. In his final days, Alyosha spoke to Alyosha about what would happen after he died. He asked Alyosha to get a good dog and name it Zhuchka, after his own dog that had died, actually killed, as Alyosha had been tricked into feeding it a piece of bread with a pin inside, an act that tortured his conscience. He asked to be remembered sometimes when Alyosha played with the new dog. This simple request, to not be entirely forgotten, to continue to exist in someone's memory, revealed the boy's understanding of death and his hope for a kind of immortality through being remembered with love. Part 11. Ivan, Smerdyakov's confession. As Dmitri's trial approached, Ivan began his own investigation into the murder. Through a series of 3 meetings with Smerdyakov, the terrible truth gradually emerged. Smerdyakov had killed Fyodor Pavlovich, not Dmitri. The illegitimate son, the servant who had absorbed Ivan's nihilistic philosophy, had taken those ideas to their logical conclusion and acted on them in a way Ivan himself never would have. In their first meeting, Smerdyakov spoke in riddles and hints, enjoying Ivan's confusion and distress. In the second meeting, he was more direct, revealing that he had killed Fyodor and stolen the 3,000 rubles. He explained his reasoning: if there is no God and no immortality, then everything is permitted. This was Ivan's own argument, his philosophical position, now turned into an actual justification for murder. Smerdyakov said that Ivan wanted the old man dead, perhaps not consciously, but the desire was there. By leaving town the day before the murder, Ivan had given tacit permission, or at least had ensured he would not interfere. The accusation was devastating because it contained truth. Ivan had not ordered the murder, had not consciously desired it, but he had created the intellectual framework that made it possible. He had taught Smerdyakov that morality was merely social convention, that without God, there was no real basis for distinguishing right from wrong. Smerdyakov had simply taken this teaching seriously and acted on it. Ivan was not legally guilty, but he was morally responsible, an accomplice in philosophy if not in fact. The devil's visit. The guilt and horror of this realization drove Ivan to the edge of madness. In his fevered state, suffering from what was called brain fever, he hallucinated a visit from the devil. But this was not the traditional devil of religious iconography: no horns, no tail, no dramatic grandeur. Instead, the devil appeared as a shabby gentleman, middle-aged and middle-class, wearing unfashionable clothes and speaking in clichés. He was the devil as bourgeois mediocrity, as the comfortable cynicism that denies ultimate meaning while enjoying material comforts. The devil taunted Ivan about his philosophical pretensions. He pointed out the contradiction at the heart of Ivan's position. Ivan claimed not to believe in God or the devil, yet here he was, consumed by guilt over a murder he had not committed. A true atheist would sleep soundly. It was only Ivan's suppressed belief, his inability to fully embrace his own nihilism, that caused his torment. The devil suggested that Ivan was a believer despite himself, that his intellectual rebellion was only a surface phenomenon covering a deeper faith that he could neither accept nor entirely reject. This conversation, really an extended hallucination, a dialogue between different parts of Ivan's own mind, explored the consequences of his ideas in excruciating detail. The devil was simultaneously mocking and sympathetic, pointing out that Ivan's suffering proved he was more moral than his philosophy allowed for. If everything really was permitted, why was Ivan so tormented by what had happened? The answer, uncomfortable as it was, suggested that some things are not permitted, that morality has a reality independent of belief, that conscience exists whether we acknowledge its authority or not. Smerdyakov's suicide. The morning after the devil's visit, Alyosha brought terrible news. Smerdyakov had hanged himself during the night. He left behind a note confessing to the murder of Fyodor Pavlovich and giving precise details about how he had done it. This suicide was both a confession and an accusation. Smerdyakov took full legal responsibility for the murder while also testifying to Ivan's moral complicity. He could no longer bear the weight of what he had done, but he made sure everyone would know that he had not acted alone in spirit, that his crime was the logical outcome of ideas he had learned from his intellectual better. Part 12. A judicial error. The trial. The trial of Dmitri Karamazov became a major event in the province, attracting attention from journalists and spectators from far beyond the local area. The courtroom was packed with every segment of society: nobles, merchants, peasants, intellectuals, society ladies who came as if to a theatrical performance. The trial represented more than the fate of one man. It became a kind of referendum on the younger generation, on questions of morality and faith, on the very possibility of justice in a changing Russia. The prosecutor was a skilled orator who presented the case against Dmitri as a parable about patricide and generational conflict. He argued that Dmitri represented everything dangerous about modern youth, their disrespect for fathers, for tradition, for established morality. He painted a vivid picture of a degraded sensualist driven by base passions to the ultimate crime. The circumstantial evidence, the prosecutor argued, was so overwhelming that it amounted to proof beyond reasonable doubt. The defense attorney was equally brilliant, a famous lawyer from Moscow who had been engaged by Katerina. He argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that alternative explanations existed for every fact the prosecution presented. He portrayed Dmitri as a passionate but fundamentally noble man, driven to extremes by his father's cruelty but incapable of actual murder. He pointed out the absence of direct evidence. No one had actually seen Dmitri kill his father, the murder weapon was never found, and the 3,000 rubles could be explained without assuming murder. Katerina's testimony. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Katerina Ivanovna took the stand. She began by testifying in Dmitri's defense, describing his nobility, his capacity for generous impulses, his essential goodness beneath the wild behavior. She clearly wanted to save him, to use her testimony to counteract the prosecution's damning narrative. But then the prosecutor asked a simple question. Had Dmitri written her any letters threatening his father? Katerina hesitated, and in that hesitation, years of complicated emotions, love, hatred, pride, wounded dignity, jealousy, all crystallized into a single decision. She produced a letter Dmitri had written to her while drunk, a rambling, incoherent document in which he expressed his desperate need for money and said he would get it even if it meant murdering his father and robbing him. The letter was devastating, seeming to prove premeditated intent. Why did Katerina produce this letter after initially testifying in Dmitri's defense? The psychology was complex. Part of her genuinely wanted to save him, but another part, the part that had been humiliated by his preference for Grushenka, that had suffered from his treatment of her, wanted revenge. Her pride had been wounded too deeply. By producing the letter, she simultaneously punished Dmitri for choosing Grushenka over her and proved her own moral superiority through the very act of destroying him. It was an act of extraordinary psychological complexity, revealing how love and hatred can become almost indistinguishable in their intensity. Ivan's testimony. Ivan, burning with fever and barely able to stand, forced himself to come to the trial to testify. He stumbled to the witness stand and produced the 3,000 rubles that Smerdyakov had given him, the actual money stolen from Fyodor Pavlovich. He announced that Smerdyakov had confessed to the murder before killing himself, that his brother Dmitri was innocent, that the real murderer was dead. But then Ivan's testimony took a bizarre turn. He began laughing wildly, claiming that he himself was guilty, that he had wanted his father dead, that he had inspired the murder with his philosophical ideas. He shouted that everyone was guilty, that they were all murderers. Katerina screamed, Alyosha rushed to his brother's side, and the courtroom descended into chaos. Ivan collapsed and had to be carried out, clearly delirious with fever. The court faced a dilemma: how to interpret this testimony. It seemed clear that Ivan was seriously ill, possibly mad, suffering from brain fever that made his statements unreliable. The money he produced could be explained away. Perhaps he had obtained it elsewhere. Smerdyakov's confession, as reported by Ivan, could be a fevered delusion. The court ultimately decided that Ivan's testimony was inadmissible, the ravings of a sick man rather than credible evidence. The trial continued as if his dramatic intervention had never occurred. The verdict. After brilliant speeches from both the prosecutor and the defense attorney, the jury retired to deliberate. They were simple men, mostly peasants and lower-middle-class townsmen, asked to decide a complicated case that turned on psychological and philosophical questions as much as on facts. After several hours, they returned with their verdict: guilty of patricide, with no recommendation for mercy. The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Many had expected acquittal or at least a recommendation for mercy. But the jury had been convinced by the prosecutor's argument, by the weight of circumstantial evidence, by Katerina's letter. They believed that Dmitri, driven by passion and need, had killed his father. An innocent man was convicted because the truth was too complex, too psychological, too dependent on understanding ideas and motives that could not be proven in a court of law. Dmitri received the verdict with strange calm, almost relief. He had been living in suspense for months. Now at least the uncertainty was over. He was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in Siberia. Grushenka cried out in anguish, Alyosha bowed his head in prayer, and the courtroom erupted in argument and discussion. Justice, such as it was, had been served, but it was a justice that punished an innocent man for a crime committed by someone else, someone whose guilt would never be officially recognized. Epilogue. Plans for escape. After the trial, Katerina and Ivan, who had recovered somewhat from his illness, though he remained mentally fragile, arranged for Dmitri's escape. They bribed guards and made elaborate plans to help him flee to America before he could be sent to Siberia. Katerina had finally admitted to herself and to Alyosha that she loved Ivan, not Dmitri, and that her devotion to Dmitri had been a form of pride rather than genuine love. Now, she worked with Ivan to save the man she had once claimed to love, not from love, but from a desire to atone for her destructive testimony. Dmitri, when told of the plan, agreed to escape, not because he feared suffering, but because he could not bear the thought of spending 20 years in Siberian mines for a crime he did not commit. He declared that he would go to America and work as a simple laborer, that he would suffer and atone for his real sins, the theft from Katerina, his dissolute life, his violence toward his father short of murder, but he would not suffer for patricide. Grushenka declared she would follow him anywhere, to America or to Siberia, that she would never leave him. Alyosha's funeral, the speech at the stone. The novel ends not with Dmitri's escape, but with the funeral of little Alyosha Snegoryov. The boy had finally died, and the schoolboys who had become his friends carried his coffin to the cemetery. It was a cold day with snow beginning to fall, and the boys walked together through the white landscape, united in their grief and their love for the child they had lost. At the cemetery, by a large stone where Alyosha had loved to play, Alyosha gathered the 12 boys around him and delivered a short speech that contains some of the most important ideas in the entire novel. He told them not to be afraid of life, that there was nothing higher or more wholesome than a good memory from childhood. He said that even if they became wicked later, even if they did terrible things, if they preserved the memory of this moment, of how they loved Alyosha, of how they stood together at his grave, that memory could save them. One of the boys, Kolya, asked whether it was really true what religion says about resurrection, whether they would all rise from the dead and see each other again, including Alyosha. Alyosha answered with quiet certainty that yes, they would certainly rise, would certainly see one another again, and would joyfully tell each other all that had been. Kolya responded with simple wonder. Oh, how good that will be. Alyosha told the boys to finish crying and to go to Alyosha's funeral feast, where they would eat pancakes. This detail, the eating of pancakes after a funeral, was part of Russian Orthodox tradition, and Alyosha noted that it was an ancient, eternal thing with good in it. He told them to go hand in hand, and the boys responded by shouting hurrah for Karamazov. They walked away together through the snow, Alyosha in the center, hand in hand, a small community of love and memory making its way through the vast Russian landscape. Conclusion. The novel ends with hope rather than resolution. Dmitri will escape to America with Grushenka, beginning a new life of honest labor far from Russia. Ivan will slowly recover, perhaps, chastened by his encounter with the real consequences of his intellectual rebellion, cared for by Katerina, who has finally admitted her love for him. Alyosha will go forward carrying Elder Zosima's teaching of active love into the world, building communities of compassion and memory wherever he goes. The great questions raised by the novel remain unanswered. Why do children suffer? How can we accept a world containing so much pain? What is the relationship between freedom and happiness? Is faith possible in the modern world? But Dostoevsky suggests that perhaps these questions are not meant to be answered through philosophy or theology alone, but lived through in the complexity of human relationships, in the choice to love despite suffering, in the cultivation of sacred memories that can sustain us through darkness. We are all responsible for all. This was Elder Zosima's teaching and the novel's final wisdom. Not the isolated guilt of one murderer, but the collective responsibility of a family, a society, a humanity that creates the conditions for tragedy. And yet, also the collective hope that if we are all responsible for all, we are also all capable of saving all, through the simple but profound act of active love, through patience and persistence in loving even when love seems futile, through the preservation and transmission of good memories that can redeem even the most terrible experiences. The Brothers Karamazov is ultimately a novel about faith, not faith as intellectual assent to propositions, but faith as a way of living in the world, as active love, as the choice to embrace life despite its suffering, and to work toward the transformation of that suffering through compassion. It acknowledges the power of Ivan's rebellion, the genuine horror of undeserved suffering, the seeming impossibility of maintaining faith in a world so filled with cruelty and injustice. But it proposes, through Zosima and Alyosha, that this difficulty does not make faith impossible, only more necessary, more precious, more transformative when it is achieved not through ignorance, but through full awareness of everything that argues against it. The end.